And welcome to today's Women in Sporting Heritage session on day 2 of the Sporting Heritage Conference. My name is Belinda Scarlett and I'll be chairing today's panel. I'm delighted to be joined by the panel today. We have Stephanie Hilborne OBE, who's CEO of Women in Sport, Brigid Power, a heritage consultant, and Julia Lee, also a heritage consultant, who both work in women's sport. I'll ask the panel to introduce themselves and their work shortly, but first a little bit about me and my involvement in women's sport and heritage. I'm curator of women's football at the National Football Museum in Manchester. And at the museum, we've built better representation into our strategy. We aim to increase our representation of women in football to 50% across our collections and exhibitions. And so my work involves working with the women's football community at all levels to identify new objects for our collection. I research the collection and provide access to it through exhibitions, digital content and events. Earlier this year, I curated our new Lily Parr Gallery, which was funded by AIM, the BIFA History Makers Scheme. And the display brings together new objects, new research and newly commissioned artworks to bring Lily Parr's legacy to life. It was co-created with women and girls and shows Lily's story within the context of the wider women's game in the 1920s and 30s. And hopefully it shows how her history is still relevant today. It's the first time we've had a space dedicated to women's history in our museum, and I really hope that it will be the foundation for our approach to women's football going forwards. In 2022, we hope to open an exhibition exploring 100 years of women's football, and that'll celebrate the UEFA Women's Championships being in Manchester and across England next year. I'm particularly interested in the archiving process and how we gather information about women's football history alongside the community and how we display that in public spaces like the National Football Museum. This year, I also work with Sporting Heritage CIC on their annual flagship event, the National Sporting Heritage Day, which takes place on the 30th of September. So now I'd like to welcome you to our panel. I'll ask each of you to introduce yourselves and just a little bit about your work. So I'll start with Julia, just because she's on the top left of my screen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Belinda. And thank you for that welcome. And it's just, it's actually 100 years this year of Women's Rugby League as well, which people wouldn't actually know because we uncovered some unknown history that in 1921, there was 2 years of Women's Rugby League in Australia, which was outstanding. And they used to attract 20 to 30,000 people in Australia, which is absolutely amazing. So, and now you'll get from that, everyone, that my interest is rugby league. Well, it's history of women's sport, well, history of sport, to be honest, but particularly with an emphasis on women's sport. And I've been working for Sporting Heritage alongside Brigid as well around collecting, of which we'll talk a bit later about the Sport England project about collecting women and disability. But I wanted to share you a bit about my journey, really, and I'm just going to put some slides on about my journey sort of in the sporting history, which actually started with myself, because I do like to talk about myself and what I'm doing. I started when a woman approached me. She was basically a playwright. And there was this picture that's actually forefront of here because I was the first female rugby league referee in rugby league in 1987 and got to professional levels, refereeing men's and internationals. And there was this big picture of me in, we don't have much in our heritage in rugby league, which I'll talk a bit about later on women, but there was a big 6-foot picture of me and I'm tall anyway. So it was quite, and she just said, I want to write a play about you. And I went, why on earth would you want to write a play about me? What have I got to give to history or anything or a tale to tell? And that's really where my journey with heritage started, because after that, and obviously I have a tale to tell. You know, I was one of the first women. I had all sorts of things happen throughout sort of my history in the sport to where eventually the play was written. And we used the play in 2017-18 in order to get women's voices in rugby league. As I've mentioned, there was nothing in an International Women's Day. We were invited to the Rugby League archives, and I came along with my box of goodies, and they had nothing else in women in rugby league at all in the history, a bit like you were saying about the football. So I thought, well, this is wrong. So we used the play ref obviously we were very adventurous with the name, to go around and collect women's voices in 2018. In 2018, taking it into small communities, doing the play, which is a very funny but poignant play, which actually doesn't, which tells the full stories. And we got the women's voices. So we recorded over 50 voices of women, right from them being supporters, being mothers, to being first medics, to being first club secretaries, for a whole host of things, all who said to me, we haven't got a story. So then that opened up, well, we've got so many stories out there that we just don't know, that we need to start investigating. So that was the start of my journey. I've then been doing some work with Sport and Heritage, but I've just got a heritage project in, which I will talk about a bit later, about capturing. We had our first tour in 1996 of the Great Britain Lionesses, and there is nowhere in history. There's 50 women uncapped. There's no Hall of Fame for women. There's just no memories of them. So I've got a bit of an ongoing project. So as you can see from my passion and my initial introduction, you know, the history of women's sports is so important to me, and it gives the credibility to those women. These women, when you talk to them, particularly the Lionesses, have been forgotten, and they've not been capped, and they've not been valued by the sport, and that's what the project will aim to do.
Perfect, thank you, Julia. On to Brigid, please.
Hi, thanks. I feel like I haven't got as many claim to fames as Julia, and I'm not that interesting. Although my claim to fame, my sporting claim to fame would be, I was the only girl at the Ian St John's Soccer School when I was 10, and I was on the front of the local paper. So that's, you know, that's all right. So hi, my name's Brigid Power. You've got a double whammy of rugby league this afternoon, because I'm also in the rugby league heritage sector. I've worked in the museum sector for about 16 years now at various museums in England and Scotland. And in 2015, I joined Rugby League Cares, which is a charity linked to the governing body of Rugby League, the RFL. So the charity focuses on supporting player welfare and working on mental health projects, but also has a massive role in looking after the heritage of the game. So my role was as a heritage manager. I work kind of on a consultancy basis now. And we've got a vast collection documenting the sport's 126-year history, which is housed at Heritage Key at the University of Huddersfield, and it's looked after there brilliantly. But as Julia says, we've got a massive dearth of anything really relating to women, and I think that's particularly disappointing in a sport that really thinks of itself, and it is in so many ways, as diverse and inclusive. And we might talk later about the Rugby League World Cup, which should have been this autumn, but it's going to be next autumn. And you know, it's one of the, I think it's the first World Cup, Julia will correct me if I'm wrong, to have the men, the women, and the wheelchair rugby league all paid the same on the same stage, given the same amount of prominence. So it's, you know, it's a great sport for all those things. But then when we look at collecting our own history, we're lacking in certain sections of it. So part of my role at Rugby League Cares is working also with the Rugby League foundations. I know there's a couple of people on, hopefully in the audience, certainly from Warrington Wolves, I know. So all of the top flight clubs have some kind of heritage presence. They either document and they collect, or they're running memory sessions and reminiscence clubs, or working with their local communities on an array of different projects. And it's a real thriving community, that in rugby league, and it's something that's really joyful to be part of. So following on from that, in 2018, I started a PhD looking into whether engaging in sporting heritage projects, but particularly rugby league projects, can facilitate a process of social inclusion. So there's kind of been a lot of research and debate in the last 20 years about the social role of museums and heritage and archives. And, you know, we've kind of gone a shift from looking after objects and providing education sessions for, you know, children, which are both really important roles of museums, to looking at how museums and heritage can actively create social change where it's needs to, and how museums can go from can be a place where everyone, regardless of your gender or your ability or your sexuality, where they are places for everybody and that they are welcome. And it's about providing opportunities for people to participate in their own heritage, really. So I'm looking at kind of ultimately what, for people who engage in these projects, what motivates them, what are their experiences, and what comes out of that, so on an individual level, but also on a community and societal level, really. So I've also been working alongside Julia to look at the Women in Sport project with Sporting Heritage. So hopefully we'll talk about that and some of the things that we've uncovered. So yeah, really pleased to be here to talk about that. So thanks.
Brilliant, thank you. And finally, Stephanie.
Well, thanks very much for involving me in this, actually, because I feel like a bit of an interloper. I spent the first 27 years of my life in the environment, and in particular in the Wildlife Trust movement, and found that to tell the story of what we needed to do for the environment, understanding the history was fundamental to that. And in fact, you know, a chap who was involved wrote the most amazing epic book of the first 100 years of the Wildlife Trust, and every single minister I spoke to or talk I gave, I always ended up couching in history. So I came into Women in Sport 2 years ago. I came in because I knew I'd only survived as a woman in the environment movement, getting beaten up by aggregate companies and everything else for 30 years, because I'd played team sport. And I knew every time I was at the worst point, my resilience came from the sort of image of my coach screaming at the sidelines and knowing that however much we were losing, we kept going. And I witnessed the inequality of revision of school sport and my own children and all the rest. So I was sort of fired up generally from the outside seeing that. I joined Women in Sport, and one of the first questions I asked was, what was the history? What was the history of the organisation? What was the history of this and that? I got in touch with Anita White, who holds our archives. And I'm going down on Thursday finally to Chichester to look at those. And then heard about this project. So I'm just so pleased that this project is happening and that you guys are doing this incredible work. I mean, we were founded in '84. Some of you probably know, have been connected with us for years, and I'd love to pick up with a number of you. But obviously that was the first year that the women were allowed to run the Olympic marathon. It was another 16 years before we were allowed to take part in the pole vault. You know, sort of rationales obviously given around our wombs falling out and everything else. And at the time, you know, even making the case that actually our wombs probably wouldn't fall out unless we were really ill when we started the run up, and everything else has taken a very long time. So I think that the role of the charity has adjusted over the years, and Anita White and Celia Brackenridge, who founded the charity, were respectively the captains of the England hockey and England lacrosse team. They also very, very intelligent academic women who recognise the value of history, the value of research, the fact that they couldn't make their point without having the evidence. And so the charity is kept to the principle of research and evidence base. We have a brilliant little team that is really expert at insights work, and our interface is with the social value of sport. And what we're doing continuously really is building up our understanding of the lives of women and girls, and therefore and how those lives interface with sport and exercise, and trying to communicate that whilst we're not technically banned from football anymore, we are technically allowed to be part of most games now. Really, the culture hasn't shifted. Culture takes hundreds of years to shift, and really there are a huge number of other impediments which stop us being as involved as we should be. And we look at life stages when we consider that in particular. So, you know, we're doing a deep dive this year into the under 11s, where it all begins. Our self-belief, apparently, from the Youth Sport Trust stats being knocked out of us even during primary school. We've done a lot of work on teenage girls, and that's really been picked up by the Republic of Ireland. We've done some great work. We're doing more work with camogie and various sports in Ireland. We haven't done that much work so much on the sort of the maternity pre and post years. We've done a really good look at midlife though, done some big work on the menopause and perimenopause, but also all the different impacts of the sort of pressure cooker of responsibility on midlife women. And the other thing the charity obviously wants to try and do is, having highlighted the problem, work on solutions. So traditionally, we've spent quite a lot of time with the national governing bodies trying to help them with their efforts to engage and then retain women and girls in their sports. But we've also been doing some quite interesting programs like the Daughters and Dads program, which is about primary school age girls and their fathers and their relationship, and how to build that into the physicality and, you know, build up physical literacy, which has some really cute sort of byproducts, like the girls starting to hug their dads for the first time in the morning, having had no physical relationship really with their dad before, and lots of quite interesting things. And having done our work on midlife, talking to employers, ranging from Vitality's corporate partners to big developers like Argent, about their workplace and what they're doing to support midlife women in their workplace to be active, given the incredible need for us health-wise to be active in midlife, but also frankly our right to have some fun. So that's sort of about the charity, and I think when we get into the history, I think that because in the end all the work we do is trying to look at what is it in life that's preventing girls and women getting the same joy and fulfillment from sport that has been assumed. I mean, I know that not all boys and men get it now, but you know, it's been assumed as a right of boys and men for so many centuries. What's stopping that? It takes us into all sorts of different territories, as I've said, you know, around the workplace, around you start looking back at state provision of childcare, you start looking at the history of maternity policies, and because that all affects it in the end. But you know, it's really exciting to be with you guys and to hear about some of that history. I'm also I'm really interested in the regional differences within England of the lives of women and sport. I think it's absolutely fascinating. So really not that surprising to me that Rugby League has got such a presence in this conversation, actually.
That's brilliant. Thank you all. That was actually fascinating. I'm starting to wish I was in the audience because I have about 1 million questions. So I'll have to set aside some time to ask you all afterwards. But before we start the main area of discussion, we thought it'd be useful just to get a bit of background on Sporting Heritage's role in women's sport in history and the project that both Julia and Brigid have been working on, which is, I think, funded by Sport England. So could you give us a little bit of background about what the project was and what the aims were and what you achieved?
Yeah, of course. Well, in 2019, Sporting Heritage received a grant for the delivery of a 3 project, and Brigid and I have been involved for the last 2 years. And basically it was to work with small and medium national governing bodies to establish an understanding of what heritage collection. It's been fascinating as well, with an emphasis on women and disability. Interesting, someone that even started it. So it was really hard to get that emphasis because they'd not started any collections. They didn't even know what collections meant either. So what is a collection? You know, how do you actually gather things? And so over the 2 years, we've spoken to over 100, well, we've corresponded with over 120 national governing bodies, and 85 of those now have a Sporting Heritage website, which is brilliant. A lot beginning to build their collections, particularly around disability and women. But not just that, we've uncovered some gems of stuff that we just didn't know. And I've been involved in some of the sessions over these last 2 days. I do get really quite excited about the little gems that come up that nobody knows about or anything like that. You know, the women that have just not been heard of, the disability athletes that, you know, nobody knows around, riding for disability. Anyway, I could go on and on for hours. So we've then, part of it, it's grown in year 2, where we're able to develop podcasts, educational resources, exhibitions, one-to-one support, because something that we found is it was really overwhelming. They had boxes and boxes of stuff. What do you do with it? You know, and also it wasn't a necessary priority, particularly through the pandemic. They were all on living, to be honest. They're all on surviving as national governing bodies. And we set up, and it's really thriving now, a heritage champion group, which is a joy to go to, because the sports that have engaged their heritage champions are just amazing people who, and some of them are on this call, on this now, and they're interacting, which is brilliant. And it's about empowering the NGBs really to become custodians and disseminators of their own heritage, and make it come to life, and then support each other. So the toolkit and the resource which has been developed as part and parcel of this project is really important to them, because, as I say, it can be all a bit overwhelming, and to have a toolkit which was launched over this conference has been really, really important to them. It's been an absolute joy to be involved in the project, and as I say, uncover so much. I don't know, Brigid, if you want to add to that. I know you.
Well, yeah, just like Julia said, I think it was really interesting that we started with a lot of governing bodies that maybe didn't have either, they kind of didn't know about their own collections, or didn't know, like Julia says, what was a collection. But we also worked with people that were probably quite far down the line, but that didn't have that emphasis on women's history. And I'm thinking about a particular rugby league one, and I think that they're in the audience. So it's Warrington Wolves, and Warrington Wolves Foundation, they've always been really kind of streets ahead of with what they're doing. They document, they collect, they engage with their community using their collections in a really amazing way. And when we went to them to say, what have you got about women and disability sport, they were like, actually, we don't actively collect it. And since that, they have started collecting it. And I'm just wondering if Phil, if he's in the audience, he could put maybe a couple of the links up to, they've done some interviews with some women involved in refereeing and playing that started their careers kind of in the Warrington area. And they're amazing clips. Like, I was watching them over the last couple of days, and quite emotional, and with the aim of linking back to this morning's session about the education, aim of encouraging other women and girls to get into rugby league, as well as looking at these kind of journeys and collecting them for a kind of collecting sake. So I think the project has been great, getting people at different parts on their journey, if you see what I mean. So some at the start, some in the middle, and that's, yeah, so I think that's been really good.
Yeah. And Phil's put the links in, as
we
knew he would.
Phil. Yeah, great.
Really, really quickly. That's brilliant. Thank you. Yes, I think that does give us a really nice bit of context into, before we start the rest of the discussion, about what Sporting Heritage is doing as an organisation as well to try and promote women's sport. So just a reminder to everybody that the chat function is there, and if you have any questions, please put them in the chat function. We'll do our best to monitor them, and I'll try and save around 10 minutes at the end of the discussion to hopefully get the panellists to answer some of those questions. And if you are tweeting about the presentation, please use the hashtag SportingHeritage21. So firstly, to all of the panellists, how have women been represented in sport historically, and how and why has this changed, if it has changed at all? Anybody want to volunteer to go first with that question?
I think you should, Belinda, because actually I'm just thinking from a museum point of view, that's really interesting, I think. And what you were saying at the start about, now, kind of actively collecting those kind of women's stories and having that women's representation in a museum. I'll just bat it back.
I did have a think about it. For me, and this is my experience here at the museum, women's football was always, bearing in mind we only opened here in Manchester in 2012, so it's relatively recent, but there's been huge progress in that 10 years. So women's football, I think, was seen as an add-on for a lot of people at that point in 2012. And again, this comes back to collections. The organisation was really limited by how much material they had about women's football. So obviously you can only display the material that you've got. Because we actively collect women's football now, that has meant that we've got material that we can display. So I think that's been the shift. It's not an add-on anymore. It's central to our strategy. So it has become part of our strategy, and we have to approach all of our work with how is this going to represent women and girls, which would never have happened in 2012, I don't think. The other thing I think has shifted are the people who are interpreting it. So there wasn't a curator of women's football. It wasn't actually a predominantly male team. I think the curatorial team was predominantly male, and I don't think it's that men can't be involved in women's sport or women's sport history at all. It's just that it's very important sometimes to have a female perspective on the way that you're interpreting some of that collection. That's definitely changed. And I think women's sport generally, but definitely women's football, is almost, the history of it is almost forced into the narrative of the men's game. So men's football has this really clear collective story that everybody gets of these key points, and women's football just often doesn't fall into it, and so you have to come to it from a different place and interpret it in a different way. And I don't think that necessarily was done in the past, but that is something that I think is definitely shifting over the past few years. So yeah, that's my thoughts on it. I don't know if you agree with any of that.
Yeah, it's interesting actually from what you're saying, and it has shifted actually over these 2 years, because I know when I first started on this journey and in this project, you know, talking to NGBs, it was and national governing bodies, and when you look in the chat now, there's so many people talking about what they're collecting about women's sport, which is absolutely fascinating. And I remember my example was always athletics, where you know, there was some top women in athletics, and you know, a woman ran, and I keep forgetting her name, and I it's just because I've got terrible memory, who broke the 4-minute mile three weeks after Roger Bannister, and was never known in history. Her daughter didn't even know that she'd done that, and it's just like athletics had that as an add-on at an event I went to as I just started this project, and it was like, wow, you know, there's all this stuff that's going on and we just don't know about it. But I think there's been a step change, and in the chat we've got the cricket doing specific projects. We've got there's Katie Holmes talking now about Nottingham and the research she's doing, and obviously there's the Warrington Wolves that we've mentioned, that actually they're beginning to step, but making it integral to what they're doing, not as an add-on. Because I think Rugby League, I would say, they're lucky to have me. Because actually they don't have the resources to be able to collect it. They don't have as well. And it's my passion and I want to do it. And I guess you need a heritage champion to begin to do that and to research. You know, and my drive is to get these women recognised in order. Thank you. Diane Leather was the miler. Thank you, Katie. And you know, we need that passion to be able to put it central, because we're still having within Rugby League, you know, these women haven't been recognised. There's no mention of the 96 tour anywhere, and they were the last team to actually beat the Australians in a test series. Yet they're saying that the international started for women in 2017. Well, that's really disingenuous to all those women. And there's no recognition of the great things that these women actually did in sport. So actually collecting it, as I said at the beginning, puts the value and the credibility and gives them some self-esteem and respect to where they should be in the history of the sport.
That's so powerful. I mean, I don't know, Brigid, if you mind if I say a few things now?
No, of course not, no.
No, I mean, I think if you kind of think about this in the context of other women's history issues, there's a brilliant woman who has been championing the founders of the Rspb, who were all women, because the Rspb was founded to, probably most of you know, because of the trade in feathers for hats in millinery, which was making birds go extinct. And so it was women who were the chief campaigners, founders. And when they had the centenary, a blue plaque was put up by the house, the only standing house of one of those three women. The other two houses had for some reason, and it didn't even have her name. It just had erected in honour of the 100th anniversary of the Rspb, Magnus Magnuson, who happened to be their president at the time. And so this woman has unearthed the whole fact that actually it was women who started the Rspb. So there's two things with sport, isn't there, is whether women were allowed to participate, how much they participated in the history, and then what was documented and recognised, what's been erased, like the Bible, which women have been erased from history, you know, in that time since. And I think those two things are absolutely fascinating. And it's worrying, really, being 53 and part of the history, isn't it? You know, it's really scary. You know, with some things you are not part of the history when you're this age, but with sport as a woman, you really are. You know, my partner is a woman. She had to campaign. She, luckily for her, in a way, lived in the West Midlands, so not in the Southeast, where she wouldn't have won the campaign, to be allowed to play football, to be allowed to do any of the sport she was brilliant at. And we know so many people who are banned and given detentions playing football of our own age. So we're part of that history. And I just think it's so brilliant that you lot are campaigning for it, but also quite shocking that we're still perpetuating myths about where we were, like playing that rugby league. That's amazing, that story about the rugby league. So we've just got to move at another sort of ratchet it on, haven't we? Another step to make sure everything that has been done is truly celebrated, and then, you know, challenged actually by the history, because I think the history has been so appalling and so shockingly oppressive, if you actually think of what sport really means, which is to have fun, that we've been banned from it for so long. That sort of argument there should be a disproportionate investment in women's sport, more than in men's sport now, is very strong, because, you know, actually we've got to turn this whole thing over, haven't we? So really exciting that you're doing all that.
Belinda, can I come in here? So I think from my point of view, so my research kind of centres around participation in sporting heritage projects, really, I suppose. And I think, you know, my experience probably differs from Julia's in that, you know, I've worked on a lot of projects and seen a lot of projects where women, rugby league ones, and me and Julia will stop talking about rugby league at some point, but that women are really central to these projects, central to the stories, central to the projects in many guises. And I think there's a few reasons for that, but I think the main one is about how, you know, rugby league is so central to so many of these towns in the Northwest and Yorkshire. So I'm looking at the chat, and I think it's Tim mentioned about theatre projects being a really good way to get stories. And so one of my case studies in my PhD is called Stories to Stage. So this was it was a theatre project based on memories of former players in Rochdale and Oldham, former players and their wives and different fans, and the memories were pulled together by a playwright, a professional playwright, with the help of the people whose memories they were, and it was performed, and it did 4 venues in Rochdale and Oldham. And the cast in that we had 3 teenage girls and probably about 4 or 5 middle-aged women, middle-aged to older women, and they were the lifeblood of this. And they, you know, none of them were massive rugby league fans, but they all recognised that their stories were really integral to the stories of Rochdale and Oldham, as well as rugby league, because the two are kind of inseparable. And I found, so I've done a lot of work on this case study, and a lot of work kind of, it finished in 2017, but the people involved, so the former players, I think there's 5 former Rochdale players, and then these other cast members, so the teenagers who are now kind of young adults, and the middle-aged women and men involved in it, they're all still friends. They've all got this kind of massive bond, and it's these kind of shared experiences that really have kind of brought them together. But all of them seem on the same level, that it's like, yes, a lot of the stories were about what happened on the pitch, but actually most of them were about the town and how they were living, and the, you know, the things that what happened on game day, whether you were involved in the game or not. And I, you know, and I think rugby league is great for that. And I think, you know, every year in this conference we talk about that sport is so much bigger than what just happens on the pitch. And I think that's where women can really be, you know, women like these teenage girls who weren't even interested in the sport, but they now see themselves as part of that rugby league community, and they go to the games, even though, again, they're not that bothered about it, but they like the community and they like all that. And that's been kind of my experience of that in the last couple of years, which has been really positive, I think. So kind of a different side of it. So not the sport itself, but the participating in heritage projects, really.
I completely agree, actually, Brigid, because I think somebody's mentioned, it was earlier on in the chat, about looking at women who don't just play sport, but obviously involved in sport in lots of different ways. And that is what we're doing in the National Football Museum as well. So the 50% representation pledge is actually women in football. So it's women who work in football.
Brilliant.
Women who do artwork that looks at football, female football fans, obviously. And I think that's a really important part of this message. It isn't just women who play sport that we're interested in, it is women's involvement in sport across the board. And so, yeah, that's a really interesting point.
I hope you can capture all these links, because there is so exciting, everything that people are listing, but I'm worried with my technical capabilities I will lose any of them.
Hopefully we will be able to share them.
Okay.
We're obviously recording this, and I'll speak to the people in the background about how we share all the
you can save the chats. So yeah, I'm sure Fran's saving the chats.
So
yeah,
I'm sure we can share them all. So looking more about how different organisations work with trying to make representation better, and where women in sport sits on the agenda of different organisations. So we all sort of come from a slightly different background. So obviously here as a national museum, we've tried to build it into our strategy strategy. It seems ludicrous, really, that any museum or organisation should say that 50% of what it does should be about women. But the fact that we've actually made it as a statement, I think, is really important, because it holds everybody to account. And I know personally that it's much easier for me now to get work done because I can say, Ash says it there in our strategy, so we have to do it. So that's how we're coming at it at the National Football Museum as a national museum. But Stephanie, as a national charity, where does representation of women sit in what you do? Obviously, it's integral to what you do.
It is integral to what we do, and I think what we need to communicate to the world of people who are not living and breathing sport every day is, as you've begun to touch on, the value of sport to place, to culture, but also the value of sport to the individual lives of girls and women. So one of our repeated sort of challenges, I think, is that when a teenage boy goes off the rails, they may start setting fire to cars, causing all sorts of trouble and getting into gangs, into fights, and it all costs the police a lot of money, hence the origins of the major programs to try to help teenage lads, and rightly so, because those teenage lads need that help through sport. But when a teenage girl's mental health goes into crisis, we tend to implode internally. We tend to self-destroy rather than destroy the environment around us. We get eating disorders, self-harm, we become hugely anxious, and that's so much less visible and destructive to everyone else that the opportunity to sport to help us is not seen as particularly relevant. Let's use talking therapies, let's use everything else for girls. And that's so deeply rooted. I was just before this just doing a quick Google on the history of school sport, which of course came up almost straight away with Winchester College. And then I found this really weird quote about how it was only introduced because the lads were starting to be so violent towards each other and rampage around the local farms. So I think how we make this more relevant to society is going to be communicating its value, and it's quite hard sometimes to communicate that because it's so assumed that value isn't there in the same way. I think everyone accepts it's good for your health, but there's much deeper values. So if we really start to communicate how competitive sport helps you to learn to lose, helps you to build personal resilience, and how your leadership skills develop, and how you can deal with taking more risks, and all the things which, if you actually look across the board, are where women in the workforce get criticised for not being as risk-taking, for being less resilient, for not showing the same natural leadership. Then we start to communicate the value of it. And I think that's what we need to do. And this is perhaps also where this English regional piece comes in, because I think, typical sort of, and I sound exactly like that, a typical sort of Southern left-leaning, champagne socialist, traditionally saw, this is changing with generations, which is great, but traditionally saw sport as just a tribal function of masculinity. And not really of sophisticated value to society. And so if you think of something like investment from the now the National Lottery Heritage Fund, probably it would have been seen as a bit tribal and brutal and, nothing to do with heritage and sophistication. So it's great that that is changing and that sports position is being recognised in a slightly deeper way. But I think the women's sport plays into that piece as well. I just think it's quite interesting how it is perceived differently, I think, in different subcultures within our country.
And Julia, with your experience of working with the NGBs, where do you think representation of women sits within those NGBs now?
Well, looking at the chat, it's absolutely really exciting because there's all sorts of projects going on. And I think quite often, and it's not just in national governing bodies, you just need to make people aware, you haven't got anything on that. You haven't really done that piece of work, and suddenly things start happening. And there's all sorts going on in the chat about the collection of them. And national governing bodies have just got bigger and bolder about the collection and started collecting it after the event now. So it's not just happening. Some specific that are just women national governing bodies that collect it anyway. So netball has a really rich history, and they've been collecting it for a lot of years and have a great great archive, which is at Huddersfield University. And then other sports, which are a mixture of disability and women that are collecting both genders, you know, on a par. And I think just looking through that, and I must comment on it because, again, back to that social side, Stephanie, when you look at plays, and I'm from Hull originally, you might hear from my accent, but we've got a really great Hull truck who brings in some really different alternative plays, and particularly about working class and what's happened in the communities. And we've had quite a lot of women in sport plays that have been either produced in Hull or in the north. So Beryl Burton's mentioned, because that's just a brilliant play. I don't know if anyone's not seen it, you must go and see it. It's just an absolutely awesome play. And we've had a lot come through that, because I like the plays in smaller theatres around, you know, women's boxing, you know, the first women boxers, and about Beryl and various other women in sport. That is Up and Under was one of them for women as well. And it's just like, it's beginning to come through the arts and culture as these women that,
great.
yeah, which were pioneering and one of their own. But actually, it's just it's great for role models. And I think sports, and particularly national governing bodies, are seeing it as ways of the role models of the future. One of my battles has been around the Great Britain women and getting them in the Hall of Fame. And part of it was the Great Britain Lions will feel devalued if, you know, we have a Hall of Fame that's on a par with the men's. But interestingly, when the Lionesses went to the first dinner, those lions, those awesome men that have in our history books that we all, you know about and things like that, came up for the autograph of these women for their granddaughters and their children. And it still makes gives me goosebumps now that they saw the importance of that. So, you know, that's what we need to do, is the more we do women's history, and national governing bodies are seeing that, the more they're doing it, is the more we'll get women and girls playing sport, because they'll see the history, the things that the women have been through in order to get where they are, a bit like the suffragette movement. If you were to look at that, you know, why do I vote? Because women fought for my vote. You know, why do I play sport and want to be involved in sport? Because women went through such a lot in order to be able to get to where we are now, and it be on a more equal playing field. And I think national governing bodies are really seeing that.
It's interesting how quickly that gets forgotten. You know, I mean, my son's girlfriend was a great footballer, and when we were in the World Cup semi-final, I was said, "Aren't you watching the final?" And she was just like, "Oh no, I've got this to do." Don't you understand the history of, you know, it was just like, oh my God, you know, you've been playing football since you were tiny. You have no idea about what my generation went through, and we weren't allowed to. And, you know, and it's so important that it's a bit like the suffragettes getting more, you know, actually suffragette movement has got a huge amount of exposure in the last 10 years, hasn't it?
Yeah,
but in fact, it didn't get that much. I mean, obviously it was ongoing bits and pieces, but, you know, we just got to keep pushing that through, haven't we?
Absolutely. And then they do see, because I think it is important, and that's been one of my passions as well. And I think the other national governing bodies telling that the next generation, because you know, it is just so important. And actually, when they do hear it, they go, "Wow, you know, that is amazing." And we really like to, you know, and the women then are role models of the future, which is important.
Yeah.
And can I just picking up on what Stephanie said a while ago about that kind of resilience of teenage girls and things, and thinking about the teenagers that were in this theatre project and using the arts and culture as kind of a vehicle for getting people involved in sport in whatever way. Loads of the feedback from the teenagers after they'd finished and kind of a few years later was about how much they'd grown in confidence through their kind of meetings with the big players that they'd kind of known about because of Rochdale, but more importantly, the women whose stories that they were acting out, and quite a lot of those women were in the audience, so they hadn't wanted to be in the play themselves because they were older, and these girls were playing their younger selves, and you know, the girls were talking about how nervous they were playing these characters that they could see in the audience, but how exhilarating that was, and one of them, which I really loved at the end, said, I hope I've got a story to tell one day. And I just thought, oh my gosh, well, already you're making history by being in this and by, you know, kind of, you know, getting involved in things. But I just thought, what a brilliant way and a really lasting, you know, impact that it's had on them. And I think arts and culture has got a massive part to play in that for not just women, but for anyone that wants to, you know, that feels like that sport is full of stories and full of their stories, which it is, I think.
I remember uncovering it was about Miss Rugby Leagues in the 1960s, which initially was oh my goodness, stay away from. But I met some of those Miss Rugby Leagues and they were so proud of their history and what they did. And they were women of their time, you know, and actually they had to do a rugby league quiz in order to get anywhere near a Miss Rugby League. So they had to understand the sport. But they were brilliant women and they had such character. Whereas, you know, my generation would be Miss whatever in a swimming costume and all those sort of things. But apparently they dressed very decently as well, according to them. But do you know what? They were just really ballsy women is all I can say. They were just inspirational women of their time as well, that, you know, we're in a male dominated sport.
And I think the other point you made about, which was really moving actually, about these lions coming up and begging for autographs for their grandchildren or whatever, or children, I just think that's really moving. And I think there's a huge amount of support out there from the men, and particularly men of daughters, fathers of daughters. They just seem the biggest converts, don't they? And it's because you don't necessarily see it, do you, until you have your own children and you see that. So I think what you're saying is that lack of sort of judgment of the Miss Rugby Leagues, or, you know, and it's wanting the men who are obviously in this chat big time, you know, the men who are major allies for this are going to be so critical, aren't they?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I do remember one of my moments with my kids, with my ex's mother, did play county cricket when and she's now in her 80s. She was Warwickshire or something, and we were doing one of those, you know, family cricket matches outside, and she did a diving catch at the age of 70 something. It's so impressive. I remember my daughter watching her gran doing this diving catch and thinking she'll be all right. She's seen her gran do that. So, you know, just that visibility of women being tough and sporty and stuff. It's great, isn't it?
It is.
You've just mentioned something there, Stephanie, that I think, I hope we'll pick up in the next question as well, about visibility. But it also feels like there's a few threads that cross everything. Yeah. So obviously how intergenerational all this is, and how important the intergenerational aspect of it is, because it's inspiring that next generation. And that idea, and I've experienced it myself here at the Football Museum, of often men, particularly men who play sport themselves, are really, really supportive of women who play the same sport. There's the whole history of men in football that have supported women's football players historically. And I think that's also really an important thing to explore as well through what we do in our collections. But the next question, I'm hoping it might link back to what you said about role models. But so how do we break down gender inequality in representation and engagement of women in sporting heritage? What would be the key things that you think we need to do to make more progress from where we are at the moment? Anybody want to start, or do you want me to pick
I mean, you're saying in the heritage, I mean, are you sort of trying to, are you meaning that this question is about how do we expose the true past, and, you know, both positives and negatives, more than how do we change the now so that the next generation will have a different heritage?
I mean, I think what it means is changing the now, to be honest. So say we've made loads of progress and where we're up to now in the way that we represent women across sporting heritage, but how do we break it down even further? Because obviously we're not at that perfect point yet, are we? So what do we need to do more of, or less of, or who needs to be involved to make that next step and get representation even better across sporting heritage?
Well, I could kick off with a few thoughts of where our organisation's been in the interface with the NGBs, say, which in a way was particularly around the 2017 governance code, which we all successfully fought for, that 30% of women on boards target, which subsequently was just recently has changed. But I don't think really negatively. But I mean, where we're at really now, I guess, with the sporting organisations, particularly the ones who are traditionally male dominated, is that there are women in the boardroom. There are some women in the senior executive roles, but rather like with the FTSE 100 companies, the women are generally not the chairs and chief execs. They're generally not the performance directors. I mean, I did a quick count of performance directors in English and UK sport. It's actually better in the devolved nations, and found that only 3 of 34 of the bigger UK and English NGBs had a female performance director. And if you think they're setting the culture of the sport, that's quite important. So now we're moving into a position where it's about which jobs are the women in and what's the prevailing culture. So we've done this kind of a health check tool about culture, which asks both men and women working in a sport how many times they've been talked over in a meeting, how many times their idea has been owned by someone else in a meeting, and all the sort of subtler aspects of the gendered workplace. But both men and women filling it in, and whether they felt their gender has been a disadvantage or an advantage, all those sorts of things. And you can still see the striking difference in experience of men and women working in sport, even at this much more enlightened stage where there's far more talk to the change. So I think it's going to be a difficult phase. It's a bit like in my past life with the environment. You know, we went from the River Erewash in Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire borders being bright purple from the dye from the factories and blatantly, hideously polluted to much less visible forms of pollution, and with companies signing up to environment. Yes, it's a good thing. You know, we went from it being not even recognised as mattering to everyone saying it matters. But how do you then get the change when actually people think the job's done? And it's in many ways much more difficult, this next phase that we're going into, where it's less visible and people will think you're whinging when you've actually made quite a lot of progress, but the starting point was pretty desperate. And so I think that's in terms of the sports infrastructure, you know, the actual bodies that organise sport. I think, you know, that's probably where we feel we're at, but we really don't doubt the commitment of a lot of the leaders. It's not anything to say that, it's just this such a deeply rooted culture that it takes a long time to change it.
Yeah, it is, and it's really interesting. I'm chair of the International Women and Girls Advisory Group, but also I've been working with World Athletics on a gender leadership change programme, and I'm working with ECB around diversity, around their umpire programme. And it's been really interesting and refreshing around genuine change. And this comes from a woman who's been part of the infrastructure for a lot of years, where people have said they want change, but actually it's not genuine because they're not quite sure what that change means. They think it's maybe changing a few words or having the occasional woman on a panel, or, you know, those sort of things where it's infrastructure. And I think that's what we can learn from. And there's a really, Raf makes a really important in the chat around changing attitudes. Because if I remember the day in 1987 when I joined the Hull Referee Society, it was in a working men's club. Women weren't allowed in there, but I had to go because I was at the meeting. I was a referee, you know, and it was like, that was a huge change and a cultural shift. So suddenly a woman, and they did all go silent as I walked in because these men had never had a woman in there before. You know, and there's 56 referees waiting to see what this woman looks like. So, but that's the change, isn't it? And the change in attitude that wouldn't have even been thought of now. You know, we've really shifted that in a lot of sports, and that now there's genuine attitudinal change and wanting to get an understanding about these barriers, I've noticed. So yes. I will get asked as part of, because with the advisory groups gets asked, well, what do you think about this match official pathway? And we genuinely get consulted with around, well, that's a bit of a barrier. You need to look at that at a local level, you know, and then they do it. And particularly with the work we've done with World Athletics and Seb Go leading that change, you know, he has been everywhere within it, making sure that change happened, because it's around the attitude and the change in attitude to understand what the barriers are and what women are coming across, walking in our shoes more, to be able to then to make that change. It's nowhere near perfect, but there is definitely a shift, and I've seen it in the last 5 years. And that's what history can do. So you can tell stories like me walking in, you know, the working men's club and everyone turning around, what are you doing in here? Well, I'm a referee. And then unfortunately all the wives then had to come to events, which was a total new board game, a ball game for them all.
Brigid, what do you think of this?
Yeah, well, I was just picking up from something that Esther said on the chat about visibility, and I think, you know, as when I was also like her, when I, you know, was about 10 and playing football, I didn't see women play football. They certainly weren't on the telly. And I look at my daughter now, and you know, women do play football on the telly, and she has no idea that for, you know, generations and generations, men played it more than women. And, you know, I want her to, and that was interesting, Stephanie, about what you were saying about your son's girlfriend, about that, not in, you know, oh, I've got other things to do than watch that. It's all watch the cup final. It's almost like, or in some ways it's good that you don't know what we've had to go through, because it's easier for you to play football than it was for, you know, someone 20 years older than you. But I don't mean good that, you know, she obviously needs to acknowledge that everything that's gone on, but that's a really good shift, I think. But in terms of the kind of the sporting heritage landscape, I think we're really starting to make that shift with projects like this of, you know, we actively need to think about collecting women's history. And like you said, Belinda, like, yeah, it's not great that you have to write in a strategy that 50% of it needs to be women, but, you know, in 10 years time, you might not have to write that in the strategy because it will be so embedded in it. So it's about making those little changes now, or all those big changes that, you know, when our children grow up or whatever, that it's just natural and that it's just, but, you know, and I think picking up on something that Raf said, I can't see it also, but about that kind of unpaid labour of women to do with sport, with putting on sport, which Julia was massive in rugby league and stuff, wasn't it, in terms of like, you know, just all kinds of things, of periphery of actually having the match, that it's like, those are really important stories. And I think as a sector, a sporting heritage sector, that's our job, to collect those stories and to make those stories visible and to make them part of the historical record, but whilst also acknowledging, as Raf says, that we haven't acknowledged that for a really long time. And I think, you know, Julia's kind of battles with the governing body over, you know, recognising the lionesses and what have you, it's like that in itself is history, and that should be documented. And it's great that we're here discussing it, because it's on the record that this is a battle to get those things done. And hopefully in 20, 30 years time, or 5 years, you know, it will no longer be a battle, as long as that, you know, the work is being done now.
And yeah, because the other parts of history that coming into this role I've really started to explore, about the history of state childcare provision, which I don't know if people are, you probably are because you're historians, aren't you? Know, the fact that it was compulsory, and then they asked local authorities they could make it something they provided or not. So where there were a lot of working women, there was provision, which was largely in the Midlands and the North, and where women were being asked to leave their jobs as soon as they even got married, not pregnant, there wasn't any. And, you know, the history of maternity law, which, you know, I say when I have my daughter, I can only take 3 months off to keep my job. And that was 99, you know, that we only got really maternity provision in the 70s. We only got decent maternity provision because of the EU. I mean, there's a whole load of the backdrop which made it actually practical for you to be able to play any sport, you know, really, if you were going to be earning your way. And, you know, so that's all really, really matters. And I think it's sort of understanding just how awful in living memory women's lives were made. You know, my mother's generation were the Valium generation, because they were educated and then put in the kitchen to go mad. And so certainly in the Southeast, that was the pattern. And, you know, it's just think, how are you going to in any way change the psyche towards sport if you haven't got the backdrop right, in terms of now it's care provision. So 50% of women by the age of 59 are responsible for caring for an elderly relative. And that doesn't happen to men until they're 75. 50% of 75-year-old men are responsible for care, which is probably of their wives. So, you know, there's all these other factors like social care, which mean that generally in midlife, women, as they put themselves last in the pecking order, don't take the exercise they need and don't get involved, certainly in team sport, where you have to commit to 1 day a week to be in a particular place, or 2 days a week to be in a particular place. So I think if around the heritage of sport, which sounds like you're doing, you're talking about the heritage of the place, talking about the heritage of women's rights and women's time, what women's time is, which you just touched on, basically all this unpaid work that women have always done. I think that would be very powerful.
Yeah, and I know we're getting up to time, but that's just so important. Why I think particularly with women's heritage, social history is so important.
Yes, yeah.
Because it just shapes the way then women's sport went. And also I know with female officials at the moment internationally, we're talking about when the fitness test is linked to menstruation, and actually when women have children, when can they come back into officiating? Well, they have to take time off. So it's still, very much there.
Yes,
but learning from the past is so important.
Yeah, I think we could carry on for a lot longer, to be honest.
I know, it's very frustrating.
We are actually at time. I realise we've not answered any questions, but I think what we've done all the way through this discussion is actually refer back to the chat that people have been having so far. So I hope we have answered some people's questions.
The tennis one is great, though.
Yeah,
I was just going to say, I think we'll finish with this one. So I think it's from Esther. I wondered what the panel thought we could learn from sports like tennis, which seem to be further ahead in terms of gender equality. And is the recording of this women's sporting history better for tennis, or is there a correlation? I don't know if we've got anybody from the Wimbledon Museum here, because they could probably tell us. But yeah, shall we try and answer that question quickly? Can we learn from sports like tennis that have had arguably a more equitable history?
I put 2 points in. Apparently of the 10 best paid sportswomen currently, 9 are tennis players.
Wow.
So it is way ahead. And then you just have to say Billie Jean King, Martina Navratilova, the fact that there were, is it chance that in tennis there were those amazing advocates? Who knows? It was the only sport certainly I grew up with that I thought I could aspire to win, except for Olympic athletics things.
And I don't know about the recording of the sport. It'd be really interesting if there was anyone from Wimbledon here, because I don't know. I assume so, because it's always been really visible, hasn't it? Women's tennis.
And if you go to the museum, I think there's a museum, isn't there? And it definitely has a good mix.
It does.
The LTA definitely talked. I've heard someone, this is how I know about the 9 out of 10 fact. There's some people at the LTA who really are up to speed on the history of the women's game, but it's not surprising really. Billie Jean King having set up the Women's Sport Foundation in the States, you had a tennis player who really in many ways started that more formalized women's sport movement, didn't she?
And I'm not sure on the history of this, but I assume women have never been banned from playing tennis.
I think as long as we wore skirts down to our ankles,
and couldn't run around and didn't run too fast.
Things like football, for obviously women were.
No, we weren't banned.
Yeah,
and
so
I think there's a slightly a thing about you are allowed to do almost anything if you're aristocratic enough. You're allowed to play sport as a woman, be gay, whatever, because you're allowed to be an individual when you're rich enough and aristocratic. The English have always been eccentric. So I don't know if partly because the sport was seen as quite a genteel sport, that it was a bit more equal. It would be lovely to hear from them about that, maybe.
It's another area that's been great to research, to be honest, the difference between the barriers to something like football and the barriers to tennis, and how that links to either working class culture or
and individual sports and team sports. That's the other one, isn't it?
Yes, because the team sport is the big remaining gender gap, 23% gender gap.
Okay, I should probably end it there.
I know there's loads coming up in the chat. This is the one that there's been the most chat.
We're nearly 5 minutes over. So thank you, everybody, especially to the panellists, obviously, and to all of the attendees, particularly those that have been commenting. It's been really nice to see so much chat going on. I know I have to say thank you to the partners as well, Creative Core, who wanted to sponsor this session. I think you can find out more about them in the delegate pack as well. But I think all of our contact details are also in the delegate pack. So if people do want to contact any of us individually, then feel free to. I hope that's okay to say that. And thank you very much.